I still hear his voice before I remember the room. Not loud, not angry, just tired. This is why we don't invite you. The words landed in the middle of dinner, between the clink of a fork and someone reaching for the salt. For a second, I wasn't sure they were meant for me. I looked up anyway. Everyone was already still. My son didn't look at me. His eyes stayed on his plate, like he just said something obvious, something agreed upon, something already decided. No one laughed it off. No one said his name sharply. No one corrected him. The silence that followed was heavier than the sentence itself. I felt my face warm first, then my ears. That slow, creeping heat that tells you everyone noticed, even if they're pretending they didn't. My hands were resting in my lap. I remember that clearly. I remember noticing how tightly my fingers were curled, nails pressing into my palm, like my body knew something was wrong before my mind caught up. This is why we don't invite you. We. I scanned the table without moving my head. My sister was suddenly very focused on cutting her food into smaller pieces. My mother adjusted her napkin, smoothed it twice, then reached for her water as if she were thirsty. Someone at the other end cleared their throat. No one met my eyes. I waited. For someone to say he was being rude, for someone to soften it, turn it into a joke, explain it away. Even a look would have been enough, something to tell me I hadn't imagined it. Nothing came. I sat there, the edge of my chair pressing into the back of my legs, trying to understand what I was being accused of. We hadn't argued. I hadn't said anything all evening. I'd arrived on time. I'd brought what I was asked to bring. I'd smiled. I'd listened. I replayed the last few minutes in my head, searching for the mistake. Had I interrupted someone? Had my expression been wrong? Had I missed a cue everyone else understood? My son finally glanced up, just briefly. His eyes flicked to my face and then away again. There was no anger there, no guilt either, just distance, like he was repeating something he'd heard often enough that it felt true. The conversation didn't restart right away. Plates sat half-finished. Someone shifted in their chair. The air felt tight, like the room had shrunk around us. I could feel the question rising in my throat. What do you mean? When did I do that? Why would you say that? I didn't ask any of it. I imagined how it would sound. Defensive, emotional, proof maybe of whatever story had already been told about me. I imagined the looks, sympathetic but tired, the subtle sighs, the unspoken thought that I was, once again, making things uncomfortable. So I stayed quiet. I reached for my glass, even though I wasn't thirsty. The water shook slightly as I lifted it, just enough for me to notice. I took a slow sip and set it back down carefully, as if moving too fast might make everything worse. Someone finally started talking again. A cousin, I think. A comment about work, about traffic, about something safe. The sound filled the space, but it didn't fix it. It just covered it, thin and fragile. No one addressed what had been said. I nodded at the right moments. I kept my posture steady. Inside, something was unraveling, thread by quiet thread. I felt exposed in a way I couldn't explain, like I'd been criticized in a language everyone else spoke fluently, while I stood there trying to translate. I realized, sitting there, that this hadn't started tonight. The sentence didn't come from nowhere. It came from somewhere private, repeated, reinforced, accepted. And I wasn't part of those conversations. I looked at my son again, really looked this time, at how grown he suddenly seemed, how certain, how far away. It scared me more than the words themselves. I wanted to reach for him. I didn't. I wanted to leave. I didn't. Instead, I stayed in my seat, breathing carefully, counting the seconds between bites of food, letting the moment pass me over without resistance. I told myself I could ask later, that this wasn't the place, that keeping the peace mattered more. What I didn't know then was that my silence would be remembered more clearly than any argument I could have made. I didn't say anything. And that's where everything changed. Before any of this, before dinners and looks and sentences said too easily, it was just me and my son. I don't remember a moment where I decided to be strong. There wasn't a speech in my head or a promise I made out loud. It was quieter than that. It was waking up every morning and doing what needed to be done because there was no one else scheduled to do it. I learned the weight of mornings early on, the kind where the alarm goes off and your body aches before your eyes open. I'd lie there for a second longer than I should have, staring at the ceiling, calculating the day. What time I needed to leave, what I could afford, what I could put off until next week. Then I'd get up. I moved through the house quietly so I wouldn't wake him too soon, packed his lunch with whatever I had that wouldn't make him feel different from the other kids, folded clothes straight out of the dryer so they wouldn't wrinkle because I didn't have time to iron. I learned how to stretch things without calling it stretching. I learned how to say we're fine and mean we're surviving. I didn't talk much about his father, not because I was bitter, but because absence has a way of explaining itself. There were no dramatic exits, no slammed doors, just fewer calls, then none. I adjusted without announcing it. I always did. When he was younger, he used to wait for me in the evenings. I'd come home tired, shoes still on, and he'd look up like I was the answer to something. He trusted me completely. If I said it would be okay, it was. If I said I'd handle it, I did. I didn't realize how much of myself I was giving away in those years because it didn't feel like sacrifice. It felt like responsibility, like love in its most practical form. The family saw me as capable. That was the word they used when they needed something done. I was the one who could figure it out, the one who wouldn't make a scene, the one who didn't ask for much. It was said like a compliment, but it came with expectations I never agreed to. No one asked how I managed. They just assumed I did. At holidays, I showed up with food, with gifts bought carefully, with a smile that said I was grateful to be included. If I was tired, I hid it. If something hurt, I swallowed it. I didn't want to be the problem. I didn't want my son to feel like we were burdensome guests in rooms full of people who shared blood, but not effort. Gratitude was never spoken, but it was implied that I didn't need it. I was strong. I was fine. I always landed on my feet. And for a long time, that felt like enough. I thought consistency would earn respect, that showing up quietly again and again would mean something, that my son would see it, even if no one else did, that the example would be louder than anything said behind closed doors. What I didn't notice, what I couldn't afford to notice, was how easy it was for my silence to be rewritten by someone else. I didn't know when the story started changing. I only know I wasn't in the room when it did. I can't point to a single moment when things turned. There was no argument, no phone call that exploded into shouting. It happened the way most quiet betrayals do, slowly, politely, and without asking my permission. I started noticing it in the gaps. Invitations that came later than they used to, plans mentioned casually as if I already knew. Conversations that stopped when I walked into the room, then resumed with safer topics. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Everyone gets busy. Everyone forgets sometimes. But forgetting started to feel selective. I'd hear about decisions after they were made, family trips planned without checking my schedule, birthdays organized with the assumption that I'd probably be working anyway. When I asked simple questions, the answers were vague, smiles tight, explanations that didn't quite land. You didn't miss much. It was last minute. We didn't think you'd want to come. They said it kindly. That almost made it worse. The first time I realized my name was being used when I wasn't there, it came from my son. He didn't mean to betray anyone. He was just talking, repeating something he'd heard. "Auntie says you get upset about stuff like that," he told me once, shrugging, "so they don't bring it up." Stuff like that. I asked him what he meant, gently, the way you do when you're afraid of the answer. He couldn't explain it clearly, only that sometimes people said it was easier not to include me, that I took things personally, that I misunderstood intentions. I remember nodding as if this made sense. Inside, something went very still. I started replaying conversations in my head. Every time I'd asked a question, every moment I'd gone quiet instead of pushing back. I wondered if my restraint had been mistaken for resentment, or if it had simply been convenient to frame it that way. The story about me was forming without my input. "She's sensitive. She reads into things. You know how she is." I heard those phrases later, always secondhand, always softened. No one said them to my face. That was the rule, apparently. It kept things civilized. It kept me unaware. What hurt most wasn't that they thought these things. It was that they felt comfortable sharing them with my son. I watched him absorb it slowly, not with malice, but with trust. He believed the adults around him. Why wouldn't he? They spoke with certainty, with concern, as if they were protecting him from something difficult. Me. I felt myself becoming smaller in those spaces, more careful. I spoke less, smiled more. I didn't want to confirm whatever they already believed. I didn't want to give anyone evidence. There were moments I almost confronted it, almost asked directly what was being said when I wasn't there. But every time I imagined the response. "You're overthinking. That's not what we meant. Why are you making this into something?" So I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, the distance grew. I didn't know then that silence doesn't stop a story. It just lets other people finish writing it for you. By the time I realized I was being talked about openly, it was already framed as concern, not accusation, not blame, concern. They didn't say I was wrong. They said I was struggling. They didn't say I caused problems. They said things felt tense around me. It was delivered gently, wrapped in careful language that made it hard to argue without sounding exactly like the person they were describing. "I just think you take things a little too personally," my sister said once, her voice low, like she was offering advice. "No one means anything by it." My mother nodded beside her. "You've always been sensitive," she added, as if this were a well-known trait like eye color or height. Sensitive. The word sat between us like a diagnosis. I asked what they meant, but I kept my tone neutral. I didn't want it to sound like a challenge. That mattered to me more than it should have. I wanted to be reasonable. I wanted them to see I wasn't difficult. "Well," my sister said slowly, "you get quiet. People don't know how to act around you. It makes things uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. Not cruel, not unfair, just uncomfortable, as if my reaction, not what caused it, was the issue. I nodded. Because that's what you do when you're being corrected politely. I told myself they were trying to help, that maybe I was doing something without realizing it. After all, I'd been tired for a long time. Stress does things to people. When my son came up in those conversations, it was always framed as worry. "We don't want him picking up on your stress. He notices more than you think. He needs a lighter environment." Lighter. As if I were something heavy he had to carry. No one asked how he felt about it. No one asked how I felt either. The assumption was already made, and it was easier to adjust around me than include me in the discussion. I started apologizing for things I didn't fully understand, for my tone, for my expressions, for needing clarification. I chose my words carefully, then more carefully than that. I laughed when I wasn't amused. I swallowed questions halfway out of my mouth. Still, the label stuck. If I was quiet, I was sulking. If I spoke up, I was overreacting. If I pulled back, I was being distant. There was no version of me that didn't conform the story they'd agreed on. I could feel the pressure building, not to be heard, but to be easier, to smooth things over, to reassure everyone that I wasn't a problem, that I wouldn't disrupt the balance they'd created without me. My son watched all of this. I could see it in the way he studied my face after family gatherings, in the way he hesitated before telling me things. He was learning when to speak, when to stay quiet, learning it from all of us. I wanted to correct it. I wanted to sit him down and explain, but every time I thought about it, I heard their voices in my head, warning me not to burden him, not to drag him into adult issues, not to make him choose. So I stayed silent. And in that silence, the pressure didn't ease. It thickened. It pressed in from all sides, waiting for me to break or apologize more or disappear just enough to make everything comfortable again. I didn't. Not yet. Things didn't calm down after that. They narrowed. The conversation stopped circling my feelings and started landing on consequences, practical ones, things that could be justified without mentioning me at all. Money came up first, casually, always casually. There were discussions about shared expenses, about helping out here or there, about what made the most sense for everyone. I wasn't part of those talks. I heard about the decisions afterward, filtered through someone else's tone. We just assumed you'd understand. It's simpler this way. You don't really need to be involved. Need, involved. Words chosen carefully to make exclusion sound efficient. Then it was my son. Pickups arranged without asking me, schedules shifted because it was easier for them, suggestions made about what was best for him that didn't include my opinion. They spoke as if proximity gave them authority, as if presence mattered more than history. I was expected to agree, to be grateful for the help, to not complicate things by asking why I hadn't been consulted. When I hesitated, even slightly, the tone changed. We're just trying to support him. Don't make this about you. You're being defensive. Defensive, another word that ended conversations without solving anything. I felt cornered in ways that were hard to explain out loud. Nothing was openly hostile. No one raised their voice. That almost made it impossible to push back. How do you argue with concern, with help you never asked for but are now expected to accept quietly? There were nights I lay awake replaying interactions, wondering how I'd ended up here, how my role had shifted from parent to obstacle without any formal announcement. I questioned myself constantly. Was I really that hard to deal with? Was I failing him in ways I couldn't see? They seemed to be waiting for something from me. A breakdown, a confrontation, proof that they were right all along. I could feel it in the pauses after they spoke, in the way eyes lingered on me when a decision was mentioned, like they were bracing themselves, preparing for impact. It never came. I showed up on time. I answered politely. I thanked them when they helped, even when it came with strings I hadn't agreed to. I kept my voice even. I didn't cry in front of them. I didn't give them the reaction they expected. Inside, though, the weight was growing. My sleep thinned out. My patience wore down. I carried the tension into work, into quiet moments, into conversations that had nothing to do with my family. I was exhausted from holding myself together so carefully. Still, I didn't explode. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't staying calm because I was weak. I was watching. I was noticing who spoke for me, who decided without me, who felt entitled to my silence. And somewhere in that pressure, between being pushed aside and being expected to smile about it, something inside me shifted. Not outwardly, not yet. But I stopped waiting for things to go back to how they were, because I could finally see they weren't going to. The decision didn't arrive like a moment. There was no night where I sat upright in bed, suddenly clear and certain. It was quieter than that. It settled in slowly, the way a thought does when it's been circling for a long time and finally finds a place to land. I stopped explaining myself. Not dramatically. I didn't announce it. I just noticed one day that the urge was gone. When someone misunderstood me, I let it sit there. When a comment was framed as concern, I didn't rush to soften it or reassure anyone that I was fine. I wasn't fine, and pretending I was hadn't protected me anyway. I started paying attention to patterns instead of words. Who spoke when decisions were made? Who was included by default? Who benefited from things staying exactly as they were?
It became easier once I stopped hoping for fairness and started observing reality. There was a strange calm in that. I kept records, not in a dramatic way, not with the intention of confronting anyone. I saved messages. I noted dates. I paid attention to what was said and what was avoided. Not to build a case, just to stay anchored in what was actually happening. I realized how often I'd been doubting my own memory, how quickly I'd accepted someone else's version of events because it sounded reasonable, how eager I'd been to keep the peace, even when the cost was clarity. That's what shifted. I chose clarity. It showed up in small ways. I stopped filling in silences for other people. I stopped volunteering information that could be used to reframe me later. When plans were made without me, I didn't protest. I adjusted quietly and noted it. The hardest part was my son. I didn't sit him down for a heavy conversation. I didn't tell him he'd been wrong. I just became consistent in a way that didn't ask for permission. I showed up when I said I would. I kept my word. I let my actions speak where explanations had failed. There were moments I wanted to rush it, to correct the damage quickly. But I knew better now. Anything rushed could be twisted. Anything emotional could be dismissed. So I waited. Not passively, deliberately. I built a life that didn't revolve around being understood by people who had already decided who I was. I protected my energy. I limited my exposure. I chose distance where closeness had only created confusion. No one noticed at first. That was the point. They still thought I was the same, quiet, agreeable, manageable. They mistook my restraint for compliance, my silence for acceptance. They didn't realize I'd stopped standing in the middle of their story. I had stepped slightly to the side. And from there, I could see everything much more clearly.
It didn't happen the way people imagine reckonings. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal that stopped everyone cold. The truth came out the way that had been hidden, quietly, through something ordinary that couldn't be argued with. It started with a document. Nothing emotional, just dates, messages, agreements that had been made without me and later explained away as misunderstandings. I hadn't planned to show anyone. I hadn't even decided what I would do with it. It existed mostly to remind me that my memory was still reliable. But then my son saw it. He wasn't snooping. He was looking for something else on my desk and paused, confused, reading more slowly than usual. I noticed the change in his breathing before he spoke. "Mom," he said, carefully, "why does this say this?" I didn't rush to answer. I didn't take the paper from his hands. I just told him what it was, plainly, what it meant, what had been decided, and when. I didn't add commentary. I didn't tell him how to feel. He read the rest on his own. There was a long silence after that, not the uncomfortable kind, the kind where something rearranges itself quietly inside a person. He didn't look at me the way he had at that dinner. There was no distance in his eyes this time, just thoughtfulness and something else I hadn't seen in a while, hesitation. Later, at a family gathering, the subject came up again. Not directly. It was framed as a joke, something light about how things had worked themselves out. Someone glanced at me, waiting for the usual nod, the usual agreement. It didn't come. Before I could say anything, before I even decided whether I would, my son spoke. "That's not really what happened." The table went quiet in the same way it had before, but this time it felt different, less sharp, more exposed. He didn't accuse anyone. He just stated what he knew, what he'd seen. He asked a question no one had prepared for. "Why didn't you tell her you'd already decided?" No one answered right away. I watched faces shift, calculations being made, explanations forming and then falling apart under their own weight. Someone laughed softly, tried to redirect. Someone else cleared their throat. I stayed still. I didn't jump in to clarify. I didn't protect anyone from the discomfort. I let the silence do what words couldn't. I let my son finish what he'd started, in his own way, at his own pace. That was when it happened. Not an apology, not really, just a subtle change in posture. A glance passed between people who suddenly realized the story they had agreed on no longer held, that it had been heard by someone who mattered more than their convenience. I felt the shift before I understood it. The balance at the table was different. No one was looking at me like I was fragile, or difficult, or something to manage. They were looking at the gap between what they'd said and what had been shown. I kept my voice calm when I finally spoke, not to defend myself,
just to answer the question that had been hanging in the air all along. I wasn't asked, I said. That was all. No one argued with it. There was nothing to argue against. It didn't sound emotional. It didn't sound resentful. It sounded factual, final. The conversation moved on eventually, but something had already settled. A recognition that couldn't be undone, that I hadn't misunderstood, that I hadn't imagined it, that my silence hadn't been permission, it had been restraint. As we left that night, my son walked closer to me than he had in a long time. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. What I didn't know then was how much that moment would change the way things unfolded afterward. Not loudly, but permanently.
After that, things didn't snap back into place. They shifted. Not all at once, and not cleanly. There were no group messages acknowledging what had happened, no family meeting where everything was laid out and resolved. Life just continued, but with a slight hesitation now, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. Invitations still came, but they sounded different, less assumed, more deliberate. People asked instead of deciding. They waited for answers instead of filling in silence for me. It wasn't kindness exactly, it was awareness. And awareness changes behavior in small, noticeable ways. No one apologized the way movies teach us to expect. There were no long explanations or emotional confessions. A few sentences here and there, a pause before speaking, an unfinished thought that didn't need finishing. That was all. I didn't chase more than that. I didn't offer forgiveness either, not because I was angry, but because I wasn't ready to pretend nothing had happened. Some things don't need punishment. They just need distance to be understood properly. With my son, it was slower, quieter. We didn't sit down and unpack everything in one conversation. We talked in pieces, on drives, while washing dishes, in the spaces where honesty feels safer because it isn't announced. He asked questions I answered simply. I didn't rewrite anyone as a villain. I didn't make myself a hero. I told him what I knew and what I didn't. I let him arrive at his own understanding. That mattered to me more than being vindicated. Trust didn't come rushing back. It rebuilt itself the way it had the first time, through consistency, through showing up, through letting time do the work words couldn't. I noticed something else too. I was lighter, not because things were fixed, but because I wasn't carrying everyone else's version of me anymore. I wasn't managing reactions. I wasn't editing myself to fit into a space that had already decided who I was allowed to be. I kept my boundaries quiet. I didn't explain them unless asked. I didn't justify them at all. Some people adjusted. Some didn't. That told me everything I needed to know. I still show up, just differently now, with more space around me, with fewer expectations, with a steadiness that doesn't require approval. What happened at that dinner doesn't echo the same way it used to, not because it was forgotten, but because it was finally understood, for what it was and for what it revealed. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever been made small in a room full of people who were supposed to know you best, you're not alone. You don't have to explain everything. You don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes staying quiet long enough lets the truth speak on its own. And if that resonates with you, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. You can like and subscribe too. Quiet strength has a way of finding the people who need it most.